For my presentation, I decided to focus on the Middle East and more specifically the war against ISIS. It is no secret that ISIS is a known terrorist threat to our way of life. The war with them has been going on for almost a decade under various different names, starting out with Al Qaeda. Now we continue to fight the war despite less public appearances of it. So, to appreciate the conflict or to understand the conflict, the first thing you need to know is the actors. And although this is not directly involved with this chapter, it is important anytime you discuss conflict. Um, the actors actually range around the world, but the primary actors I have listed here are ISIS themselves, the organization, the Western powers, the governments that have helped to contribute to the beginning of the war and are now working together trying to end the war, and the Middle Eastern countries who are unfortunately home to the terrorist organization cells, not necessarily because they want to be, but because that just happens to be where ISIS originated. Causes for the war. Um, ISIS wanted to rid the Middle East of Western influence. They wanted their way of life, whether that be their political ideologies or their religious ideologies. It was a combination of all the above. Now, the causes for war are the Western powers are trying to defend the world from a hostile terrorist cell. Um, the causes of war have obviously shifted from the beginning to the end. Originally, it was Al Qaeda that wanted to get their way of life back, and now we have the Western powers who are continuing the war more or less to end the terrorist threat, not because they just want to fight constantly. The type of war that this would fall under is guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a war with little to no rule following. It is where you have no government agency that is directly causing the war, or at least one of the parties isn't a government agency. So you have ISIS, they're a terrorist cell, not a government. If they were a government, you would have a country's army of some sort. Instead, you just have the terrorist cell that is ISIS, who has risen from a group of radicals that are trying to regain what they think is the correct way of life. They want to have the power to control that, and they would like to get rid of all the influence from the Western world, which we are a part of the Western world, so we don't see the issue with what we're doing necessarily. Um, to understand the conflict, you have to realize that just because it's our way of life doesn't necessarily make it right for us to try to control another region. Um, However, this is not me condoning ISIS. ISIS is still a terrorist cell. They are still a threat. They have still acted outside of the proper ways of handling conflict. So there's a healthy balance somewhere in the lines here that we have not dealt with yet. The level of analysis that is most applicable would be global. Yes, I listed off the actors previously, and yes, they were focused in the Middle East and the Western powers. However, that doesn't end there. ISIS has global reach. Recently, there have been attacks in Africa. You see that they have most of their power comes from radicalizing random people, uses of the World Wide Web, spreading their hate speech and their ideologies, and it gets around, and they are now a global terrorist threat. They are not localized to any one place other than their home base being in the Middle East and their primary target being in the Western power countries. As I have mentioned multiple times, ISIS is a terrorist cell. That was a major part of this chapter. Terrorism is never okay. It is a war that goes against all of the just war theory that we looked at in the previous chapter. Instead of trying to fight by a certain code, they don't fight by any restrictions. To them, more civilian casualties is a good thing because it gets more people afraid of them and spreads their word further. Whereas if we were listening to the proper way of fighting a war, the just war conduct theory, you would be trying to avoid civilian deaths, civilian impacts, and it would just be the bodies of power, the two primary actors, not any of your collateral damages. However, because they are terrorists, again, their focus is not to protect those, but rather to harm them because that is how they get a more mainstream focus and a bigger emphasis on who they are and gets their word spread out to more people. The conflict as a whole has been bloody. There have been a lot of deaths on multiple sides. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been civilian. And because there have been civilian deaths, it has caused more radicals, which is why this war did not end with Al Qaeda. It is why we still are fighting this war after a decade. And there's probably no end in sight because the war will just continue as more people are accidentally killed, more people become radicalized, sympathize with ISIS, and will continue to fight the battle. And you chop off the head once, and more grow back.